Hello, everyone, and welcome to FCI Live 2026, our online conference series. This is Don't Fling Power, the secret to GM transition. It's interesting. We both don't know how the word secret to GM transit secret got in there. Like, we are not waving a magic wand today, but there's some great information. All right, before we get started, just a huge thank you to our FCI Live champion sponsors who make it possible for the entire series to be free to everyone across the country, to all cooperators. We really appreciate you. Thank you to Frontier Co-op, Cabot Creamery Co-op, and National Co-op Grocers. All right. So today's session, I am really excited to have here with me Bonnie Hudspeth. I'm going to introduce her in a second. And this is a session that was requested a lot, both by our staff and by startups. And it's a topic that we've covered before in peer groups in different ways, at up and coming, but never in a video everyone could, or an online session that everybody could access. So, and we've got some new thoughts. There's only so much we can cover in 1 hour, in less than 1 hour, it's a little less than 1 hour, but we're going to do our very best. So I am JQ Hanna. I'm the executive director of Food Co-op Initiative. We're the ones running this series, and we're a little tiny nonprofit organization, staff of three, mighty, small but mighty, that supports the work of those starting food co-ops across the country or transitioning existing grocery stores to the cooperative model throughout the U.S. Everything, almost everything we do, everything but our conference is free, and you can find out more information about that on our website. And I'll hand it over to you, Bonnie.
Thanks, JQ. So I am Bonnie Hudspeth, she, her pronouns. I work with Firebrand Cooperative, and we are a worker cooperative, and we specialize in strategy, design, facilitation. I'm lucky enough to get to facilitate the national peer um, learning groups with FCI. So I see some familiar faces. Welcome. And you can find out more about us on our website, firebrand.coop.
Excellent. And I want to just point out that yes, not only does Bonnie facilitate some of our peer groups, the FCI peer groups. Actually, she designed the model. We based it off something she created years ago, so it's an honor to have her involved. She's literally been working through the peer learning group format and making it work longer than anyone at FCI.
Which means I've like learned all the mistakes and we learn all together. So it's been awesome getting to see this grow into a national movement in space for you all. For us, I should say, for the we, right? So yeah. So thinking about what we're trying to focus on today is to have a better understanding of the power dynamic of a startup food co-op and how it changes and how it does not change when your GM arrives, right? And then thinking through a little bit more of the definition of a unique transitional phase of governing in food co-op startups that happens during this phase that we really have not talked about enough and we're gaining a deeper understanding of. So we're really happy to be able to share this with you and to workshop it together. And then we're also wanting to make sure that we cover what we know about effectively moving through this transitional phase of governance so far so that we can share what we've learned now, right? And work and figure out what we can take away together. And before we do that, now that we have this awesome food co-op development framework freshly updated that you all have seen in peer groups, I want to just pause for a second before we jump in and talk about where does this topic fit into the development framework. So if you think about preparing for the GM transition, that's stage 3 work, right? And the actual heavy lifting of GM transition happens in stage 4. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. And yes, this work absolutely is going to continue in stage 5, though ideally the bulk of the transition work between the board and the GM and the foundation for all of this was already built in stage 4. Please, please build it in stage 4. So we're going to focus a little bit more about, okay, well, how do you do that? And as we always say, right, we do not have all the answers. Do not abandon hope. Um, the movement evolves. We don't know everything, right? And so we want to be upfront that we don't have all the answers. And it's not just us, right? It's the entire food co-op movement. We're figuring out together. We're struggling with GM transitions, not just at startups, as established 80-year-old co-ops, 50-year-old co-ops, right? Too. And so we're going to share a little bit more about there's some unique challenges to startups going through their first general manager transition. How do we figure that out? That's where we are thinking about getting to learn for all the innovating and learning from one another's experience. And I love getting to collaborate with JQ because he has this like helicopter, up high view to be like, this is trends that we're seeing. These are some mistakes we're seeing that has consistency and thread between them. So FCI learned much of what we are going to share today, and they do know about startup GM transition from the startups that have lived this transition. That might be some of you on the call, right? Green Top Grocery to Gem City Market, from Assabet Co-op Market on the East Coast, Suncoast Co-op Market, who just opened this year on the West Coast. So in this session, we're going to talking about the amount that we have learned from the 8 years of studying these GM startup transitions, so that we can give you at least a foundation to be like, we can build from this together.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So I want to talk, as you notice, we didn't put the word governance in the title. We put the word power in the title. And we're still not sure where that came from. Bonnie thinks that I said that phrase first. I think she did. We're not sure. But we're talking about how the food co-op movement really hadn't taught people how to transition power in this very unique situation. It was kind of like, oh, the GM showed up. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So we're going to talk about, yes, governance. This is a great definition on the left. If you can see my slide, the system of rules, processes, and structures that guide, control, and hold organizations or our co-ops accountable. And that's true. That's a great definition. But we're going to go down to the root of what governance is. And that's really about how we share power to get the things done that we want to get done. And it's much more complicated than that, but in a lot of ways it's not. It gets down to this question of who holds power, how are they supposed to wield the power, and how will they be held accountable to the power. So, how that looks in food co-ops. I want to start with how this looks in established food co-ops. And when I say established food co-op, I mean a co-op that has both been open for multiple years and has reached a stable, established business state. This is rarely startup food co-ops as early as 2 years after opening, occasionally, but this also includes all the co-ops that have been open 40, 50, 60, even 80 years. An established food co-op, the concept of how power flows is, and you're getting a little my bias here, is that all the power of the co-op comes from the co-op's member owners. And that's, some people go, oh, right, but they barely know what's going on. I challenge you to find a food co-op where the member owners have become disengaged or disillusioned with their co-op that is not doing very poorly and even in crisis. When the co-op owners disengage, and even quite often when they're happy, they don't heavily engage, and that can be frustrating. But when the co-op owners, they do see it. And when their co-op is not behaving like the co-op they expect and they think they charged the co-op to be, that disengagement power will flow out financially, it will flow out in engagement, you will see it on your ledger as much as in how people interact with your co-op. So I say co-op member owners, they are the power. Their collective power they brought together to build the co-op and to continue to support the co-op is where all of the co-op's power comes from. They delegate a huge chunk of this power by ratifying bylaws. So they create this concept of a board, which is made up of their fellow members. And they say, okay, we don't have time to oversee the whole co-op, make sure it gets developed, all this stuff. We're going to use bylaws to say, we're forming a board. This is what the board is charged to do. This is what it can't do. And they delegate that power when they elect the board. The board accepts that power when they choose to take on the responsibility, when they run, and when they accept the nomination. And that board has all this responsibility, was given to them from the owners, said, you need to carry out and grow the owner mission values through the running of a sustainable business. Overall, that's really what they were charged to do by the owners. Like, we don't have time to do that, but that's what we want. It's what we want our power used to do. Board says, okay, how are we going to carry out and grow the owner mission values and create a sustainable business? In an established food co-op, they delegate a huge chunk of their power and responsibility. Now, they're still responsible to the owners for all this, but they go, we can't do all this either. So we're going to delegate a huge chunk of this that we'll define as operations of the co-op to a general manager. If you're on the call and say, is that ever co-managers or a group of co-op general managers? This is not that session, but yes, on rare occasion it is. Whoever is going to fill it, it's also sometimes called in larger food co-ops the CEO role. Whoever they're going to delegate the running of the business to, they define what is operations, and then they hand responsibility for that to the general manager. And then that general manager hires staff that is also responsible to them to execute and make sure that the business is sustainable and fulfilling the values of the co-op. So just that's kind of a picture of how it flows in an established co-op. But what about a startup? You don't have a pre-store startup food co-op. Is there no power flowing? There absolutely is. We still have the co-op's member owners who are putting power, and absolutely there's some coming from the community as well, and other stakeholders, but primarily the member owners. That power, they're delegating it to the board through the startup's bylaws, and they're like, "Hey, board, you now figure out how we're gonna create a sustainable business that forwards all these values that we're excited about." So the board really ends up holding it as a startup food co-op, all of it. They don't have a GM to delegate operations to. Now, they also aren't running a daily business yet either, but there's sure a lot of work being done to develop the co-op and the business of the co-op that it would be defined as operations in any other situation. So, what does a pre-GM startup co-op board delegate? Not a heck of a lot. No. That's that's kind of the joke. This image shows what if you're on the board of a startup food co-op, you've experienced this. There isn't a general manager who go, hey, we need to have a lawyer and make sure they're looking over these documents. Hey, we need to negotiate the lease. The lease is coming up for renewal. We need you to go do that. And honestly, generally in an established food co-op, the board's not even going, hey, you need to do that. It's in the policies that they've handed the GM. The GM's going, hey, it's lease negotiation time. They're actually reminding them this is going because they're doing the operation of the business, right? The finances, overlooking the finance. Yes, the board absolutely sometimes has a finance committee, definitely has a treasurer, but overall the in-depth constant finance work to assess how the co-op's doing and what it can afford and how it's operating week to week, that's operations. Their communications, that's the marketing, committee or the marketing staff in an open co-op. All of this stuff that the board doesn't really get to say, okay, GM, here's all these pieces that are yours. You delegate that out. Our responsibility is these governance pieces and making sure that you are being held accountable to and doing a great job running this business and meeting the values. They have to decide who to delegate what to. They have to be in charge of everyone they delegate to. If you're on the board of a startup food co-op, you've been like, yeah, we tried to have an owner outreach committee. And sometimes that goes great. And sometimes you're like, it was just easier to do the work ourselves, right? And you're everything because you are a working board. You are a pre-GM working board. Operations has not been delegated.
Right. And you can see like that map that JQ laid out of like all the responsibilities. Y'all know that, right? It's a lot. It's a lot to take on. And for some of you, you've hired staff to take on some of these areas, right? Pre-GM, maybe like outreach manager, someone else. For most of us, it's like we as the working we've got it, right? The startup co-op working board before we hire a GM. Then when the GM is hired, the switch is flipped, right? We switch it and ta-da, we can hand everything off other than accepting reports from the general manager and we can wait for them to do their magic. That's where we are, right? Not so fast. We do have to take ownership over before we going any further that this was the advice that was given. Like from FCI and from other organizations, probably from me on the like regional peer calls, it was what we understood. It was like you're a working board and then GM handed off your governing board. There's no in between. And you just navigate it. And there might be some you just there's some sticky points, but we're just going to navigate it together. So if your startup has been organizing for a while and you feel you heard this advice, you're right, right? You did. hire your general manager and hand the reins over to the expert. I think what's amazing to witness on the peer calls is there's a lot more questions being asked earlier, where I think the movement itself, as people are thinking this through and they're thinking about delegation, they're thinking about what do we need to know? What do we need to train ourselves? How do we know when things are off? It is our responsibility. We are accepting power. We understand power and responsibility. So, how are we going to make sure that we're protecting and holding what we've been tasked to do by the member owners? That's a big ask. So, right, you have that, yes, it's easy to have that desire to flip the switch, and it's okay. We've got to make that known, and then to be like, okay, but it doesn't work out so well when you do that. There's something in between. You need a dimmer. Maybe that's a bad analogy, but it needs to ramp up slowly, and there needs to be some steps along the way. So we'll talk about that. And I've I've shared this slide so many times. I think JQ, did you originally create this? It seems like a very
I
JQ.
created this with Rich Larachelle. Yeah.
Okay, so this is from the up and coming Startup Food Co-op Conference in 2022, right? So we're a couple years out from that. And this is a myth that we've been trying to undo for a while. This myth, one day, this magical creature called the general manager will arrive, and then the board will be able to sit back and let this retail savvy unicorn with all the skills their co-op could possibly need do the rest. That's what I fantasized about that for sure when I was project manager, right? That there is going to be this unicorn that comes and delivers everything that we need. And there's, in the early half of the third wave of startup food co-op organizing, which I was a part of, so like 2000 to 2015, this advice was working well for many startups. And you know why? Because they had highly experienced co-op general managers available to lead them. And that was a huge factor, right? So when the startup that I was organizing, we brought a highly experienced general manager into the fold. He understood governance, he understood being a general manager, he understood and desired to work alongside of the board and to train them up and to be like, I know that a good chunk of my job in these early phases is to be working with the board so that they can understand how to hold me accountable, which is pretty amazing, right? So that's when it was working during that third phase overall fairly well. But that would take, we could take a whole additional session to cover this and debate on it because earlier in this series we talked about the GM crisis. We've been talking about the number of ways, but there was a clear trend starting a little after that third wave that treating the GM like say 2016 or so, according to JQ, who I always ask, I'm like, when did you notice these things? Um, if we treat the GM like a magical unicorn who could immediately succeed at almost every aspect of what the food co-op needed, it was actually setting up startups and boards and GMs themselves for failure. So yeah, we gotta knock that off.
It's really distinct how the first half of the third wave had a very different experience with GMs. And I will also point to, if you know the arc of natural foods industry, there's a period right in there where the competition became incredibly harder and mistakes, there just wasn't room to grow into the job anymore. You couldn't make mistakes.
Right. And so we can't just flip the switch. That's the spoiler alert. I said the dimmer analogy. We can use the dimmer maybe. And we're gonna, JQ and I had fun with this metaphor. You all have probably talked about this, right? Like, we're going to use this to help us see kind of like imagine that your startup co-op is a brand new baby and you're the first time parent. So you've taken your classes, you're ready for this baby. Um, and you are like, oh, I'm exhausted. I didn't sleep last night. I want a babysitter. I want someone to come and care for my child so I can take care of myself. When that babysitter comes into your house, do you just hand the baby to them and then go to sleep? How would that work out?
Right? Like how, so we can talk about power in the abstract. Like, yep, I get it. This is about power, it's about delegating power. Can't wait to delegate power. It feels different when we say, okay, but instead, let's hold the word power is abstract. Let's hold this a little personally. If you had just had your first child ever, and someone's going to come over to babysit that child, so you can get other things in your life done and make sure that their care is being met. Again, how does that feel in your body? Because that's what the startup is, right? This is
Yeah.
something your whole community has worked on for years, right? To this baby. And to be honest, though, this is really that moment where you've just had the baby. As much as you've been working on building up to this moment, you don't know what it's really going to be like, right? Once it opens, right? No matter how much time you've spent around other people's babies.
It's scary. And so the instinct can be, I'm so overwhelmed. I'm so exhausted. I didn't sleep well last night. Or in your case, as organizer for the last 10 years, take the baby, right? And the desire to hand it off. Or the fear of like, this is my precious baby. I don't want to hand this
Mm.
baby off at all. I'm going to have a really hard time and want to micromanage the crap out of you, babysitter, which is a totally understandable instinct, right? So there's both ends of that spectrum. So, yeah,
And
what?
preparing for this, I mean, any of us were babysitters when we were young. You know, there were the parents who did fling the kids at you, and then there are the parents who had just the emergency contact list, the outline of their bedtime routine, who walked you through and showed you where things were, who only had you babysit maybe for an hour the first time and saw how that went, right? And those by far, I will tell you, were the parents with more stable, connected relationships to their child and made me more of a success, right? In raising and meeting their child's needs. And this is, I mean, it's kind of a good metaphor too, and that I liked we were playing with if you got a resume and someone was got the just amazing references, they were the best little league coach for toddlers that had ever existed. They were phenomenal, and that means they're good with kids and they know a lot. But they still never babysat your infant. And it's a slightly different job. It's a very different job, actually, sometimes. And I use this metaphor thinking of people who have been highly successful at being a store manager for a chain grocery store.
Mhm.
Even someone who's been highly successful at being a finance manager or a grocery manager at another food co-op, but has never been a GM, much less a GM of a startup, which is even harder than being a GM of an established co-op. So it's never the exact same job.
And Edward, love your comment here about you delegate power but share accountability, right? So we're going to talk more about that. What are systems you set up to share accountability and actually to figure out where, where that accountability and delegation lies? Okay, we got it. Don't throw the baby and run. Don't fling the power. JQ is like the most brilliant slide creator. I love this. Um, but if that's the case, if you've recently opened a co-op, you understand this, right? But what is the alternative? That's the piece that is like in the oven being cooked. So what is that?
Right. And so, like we said, it's understandable that folks still think you go straight from your working board, you hire the GM, you throw the job at them, you move on. But what we figured out from studying it from the last 8 years or more now, I think it's a little over 8 years I've been studying this and watching this at food co-ops, supporting boards, supporting GMs of startup food co-ops, that there is this whole other phase that has emerged that you guys have really, the startups before you, or if you're someone here who's already open, have really helped us identify. And it's really different than a working board or a governing board. So you're not just taking reports, right? There's a transitional governance phase. It is distinctly different from the working board phase and from the governing board phase. The governing board comes when we hit established food co-op status. Questions about that? We did a video in this series on the fifth stage of organizing, which is post open but getting to stability, and that's so when you finish stage 5, we're over here, governing board, right? And before the GM's hired, we're over here, working board. And then there's something from when the GM's hired to the end of stage 5 called being the transitional board. Quick oversight of it. GM's on the team. We're pre-construction usually. Sometimes the GM comes after construction has started, but that is rare. We are transitioning operational control to the GM. That's some of the major work. We're not handing it over, we're transitioning it, and we're building trust and relationship. So when does this happen? This is definitely this work. you are preparing for it at stage three. Like I said, it happens as soon as the GM shows up. And then as we're getting to the end of stage five, we are transitioning together as a board and GM into a full governance-based established food co-op relationship where operations has stronger boundaries, is clearly defined, and the board's governance role is more clearly defined. And the main relationship in between that about for accountability is written report based. And the board is not doing anything that has anything to do with operations. But there's this phase here, and how long does that take? The phase can take a long time. A startup food co-op, usually the fastest we've seen a startup food co-op go from open to graduating from stage five is 18 months. And ironically, of course, the GM of the co-op I would say that about in recent years is like, no, 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 we're not ready to graduate yet. And boards say this too at these co-ops, and that's always a good sign, actually. It's them saying it's not perfect yet. They know what's wrong, they know it still needs stabilizing, but they've reached stability. But this phase can actually last, so it's from when you hire them to get open, and then at least 18 months after. But this phase can be a lot longer than that, as some startups can tell you. If you talk to some startups, they've been in this phase for 7, 8 years.
And that I feel like feels radical to share that JQ's summary of that because that is so as we said before, when I was a startup organizer, in 2013 opening our doors, there was very different information given. And so even though that feels, you might be feeling like, oh crap, that's a long time. That takes a lot of energy. It's so much better to understand that so then we can set ourselves up with that understanding in mind to be like, what are we going to need for capacity? What are we going to need to re-energize ourselves? What do we need to understand that it could be, it's not just like I've done my countdown is to opening day, right? It's very easy to have your countdown be opening day, of course. And the co-op's not stabilized at opening day. The co-op is just beginning a whole nother phase. So I think you were going to talk about stable versus cute.
Yeah. Yeah, I will throw this in here. This is language that I created. I have not found it anywhere else. I've done a lot of governance support for startup food quotes, but also for nonprofits. And I find this is universal as an organization is going through something. So stable, when I say an organization is stable, the organization overall has a solid foundation and can operate in a consistent, planful manner that delivers on what it is promised and is positioned to respond to challenges without significant disruption of its work or its viability. We're in an acute situation when the organization's ability to deliver on what is promised is precarious in one or more significant ways due to limited or even or uneven areas of strength or significant risk taken, or it has a very narrowed margin for error than it is in an acute state. And this doesn't just apply to startups, but you guys are definitely in an acute state as you're going through this transition. And so we have, this is on FCI's website. We really strongly suggest if you go to our website, just go to the search bar and write the word leadership or transition. This will be the first thing that pops up. This was really meant to have a third section, and only the first two got written, but they're pretty darn solid, and they talk a lot about this exact transition. And one of the things it points out is any food co-op could be going through a change in operational leadership, the GM or CEO turning over. The co-op's not done anything wrong, but it is in an acute state, right? At that point, the organization's ability to deliver what is promised is a little more precarious because we don't yet know how this GM's going to gel, how they're going to perform, how the relationship is going to build with the board, and those things can destabilize the co-op. If the board leadership has massive turnover and suddenly the board's very green, then that can be put you into an acute state. Again, the company's nothing wrong, but it's just at more risk. Same with if you don't have and this is a startup specific one. So, but when I say expansion on here, this is the other point that I would assess. And what I mean is you've taken on a major financial project. You've invested a huge amount of money to expand what your co-op does. In the case of a startup, it's to open the startup. An established co-op, this could be that you're doing an expansion, you're doing a massive reset, you're opening a second store. So, and with startups, funding is another thing that can leave you in an acute state. If you're fully funded, a lot of startups, more and more startups, unfortunately, we hope to see this trend reverse, and we understand people are under pressures and feel they have to, but are starting build out and they're in stage four when they do not have all the funding they need. So these four main points of assessment, you're hoping from the beginning to the end of this transitional governing phase to get from this red means we are not out of the woods whatsoever. Yellow means we're making some progress, and green means we're out of the woods, that we hope the operational leadership that the GM has hired, we develop a relationship, they develop skills, they show the ability to succeed in this particular co-op. But the board, you are also a giant risk. It's not your fault, but you've never been the board of an open cooperative business. It's like, in a lot of ways, like you've got a brand entirely, everyone on the board is green and brand new, right? And then funding may or may not be completely in the right place. And you have just executed a major business investment and expansion of what you do as a business, and you don't yet know if it's going to work and what you're doing. So the hope is it goes from all these things being quite acute to slow by open, that maybe we've got some instability here, but we've got progress, and that hopefully by there's hopefully in 18 months, but that is the most optimistic. These are all over here are marked as stable. But that's kind of the journey of the transitional board. It is not in the established food co-op is over here, right in the green, all the green stars. Maybe they go into an acute phase briefly because the GM turns over or something, but they are most over here. The transitional phase is unique to startups because we have all of these different points where things are acute, where things are higher risk as we transition from a startup board, then hiring a GM, then actually building a physical store and opening it. So how power might flow within a transitional board. Just so we look at this real quick, then we're more depth about what you can do. The co-op's owners, of course, delegate to the board. The board says, okay, we are going we're going to define what operations is right now, and we're going to give a significant portion of the operations to the GM when they arrive, and we're going to see how that goes. At the same time, we're going to be building relationship. We're going to see how they're doing. They're going to get comfortable in the position and figure out what pieces they can take on, how fast, and we're going to be in conversation relationship. But we have definitely not flung all the power at them. We have hopefully a financial oversight. This is strongly recommended by FCI, and now I know by leaders at NCG that the board actually have a very strong financial oversight committee. It's not uncommon that a capable GM has some grasp of the pro forma and then the budget created from that. But there are areas where they're operationally strong, but maybe don't understand the long-term financial implications on the debt that you have to pay off, or the cost that you've got a zero lease for 5 years, and then it's going to kick in at year 5, and it's going to throw your numbers wonky. That you have a strong board finance committee. So maybe you're delegating, say, we're going to have a board finance committee. And so this financial responsibility that will generally be the GMs eventually, we've got some strong players here who understand these numbers and these finances, and the GM on that committee working together on financial oversight. And maybe we're turning over a portion of our power to a board governance committee who's actually helping the GM figure out how to work with these policies, what kind of and how to interpret them, and then what kind of reports they can provide that are reasonable for them to create that actually show the board what they need to see. And then one other thing that's starting to be, I strongly suggest, starting to be suggested is there's no such thing as coming into this GM job of a startup food co-op. No one is coming into this GM job of a startup food co-op. Even those GMs who are experienced and have opened a startup before, and they are unicorns. um, they having every single skill that is needed for the role and specific to your co-op. So we suggest, and I'm starting to hear this again from other organizations, that as you find out who your GM is going to be, that they know that you're going to expect this to be a learning relationship, that they're going to have mentorship, they're going to have educational support, and they're going to be held accountable to it so they can grow into the role and eventually get to where everything that is usually considered operational established food co-op is something they can manage and delegate effectively within the operational team.
And being clear about this from the go is essential, right? So that, JQ, you were talking about that. It's an expectation upon hiring. It's not like if you would like a mentor, it's like you will have a mentor and we will work on a plan of training and development where you need it. And we got to be real about that, right? Because there's too much being asked of general managers, full stop. And then especially startup general managers, depending on when you come in, you might need to be involved in some way in fundraising. You might need to be involved in all these other pieces, depending on the strength of the project or where the project is, that it's a lot. And so coming in with this understanding of the last couple slides JQ has shared about kind of like looking at these points of assessment and understanding where everyone in the organization's strengths and weaknesses are and being real about it instead of seeing it as a deficit, seeing it as a like we're teaming together to make sure we're as strong as possible on all of these layers. We are on the same team. It's not board versus GM, right? It's not antagonistic. It is like a very collaborative relationship. And it really, I don't think there's a way to run a co-op without that, from both the GM and the board understanding that in their core, that this is how we're operating together. We are helping each other because we are both green with this particular co-op in this moment.
I think that's an incredibly good point. I'm glad you went back to it. Is that I think it's difficult because we've been like the GM's just God and they walk in and they handle everything, and we've been saying that for a long time. And so it's built a culture where it feels like, what is the board doing? Why does it think I need a mentor? Why is there a finance committee? Wait a minute, like why don't they just trust me and get out of my face? And the reason is because it's not working. It's not working for the GMs either. When especially in startups, there's simply too much work to do, even if that GM had every single skill set. And this is something we're not going to have time to go into here, but it's something that has been pointed out by NCG is that there's places where the board may even stay working for the general manager, but in some of the operational areas, helping to build up systems. If you have people on your board who are experienced in HR or again, the finance committee, that there's going to be places that will eventually, once you are an established food co-op, be under the general manager, where the board's going to be taking some of the lift, even outside of the whole, but we need to be part of a learning culture. But it has been an ongoing red flag to me for 8 years now, and I've yet to be wrong that when someone wants to tell you, a GM candidate wants to tell you everything they're capable of and what they think, and doesn't understand, doesn't give you a word to give them any feedback, isn't curious, doesn't want to, if you're like, oh, we have a mentor for you, or we have to work with this great person at NCG or Infra or at FCI, we'd love for you to meet them, and they aren't excited to do so and listening and wanting to know about the supports available to them, red flag every
Yes.
single time.
Yes.
People
Yep.
who are not from a learning culture. And the best GMs I've ever met who had the least to learn were so excited to learn and work with the GM and work with the board and broaden their knowledge. Not to have us micromanage, but and that is a line that has to be walked. But that refusal of a learning culture, of a growth culture, of
Hmm.
understanding that it takes time to build up certainty about their ability to deliver in all areas, and that outside support is absolutely necessary to do it right, that's a red flag.
Yep. And I say this with my kids all the time. It's like growth mindset is I don't know this yet, right? It's not a negative reflection on yourself. It's too much that no one could know, even if they are on the cusp of being a unicorn, right? They don't know it yet. We're going to work together to get you the systems to support yourself, which for any one of us starting a new job, you're not going to know everything. And it's ridiculous to pretend that this is the case. So, when we're thinking about what do we do to avoid flinging power? So you're in stage three, for example. Yes, Joel, there's always more to learn. So stage three, we don't want to fling power. So let's talk about some of the things you can do to prepare. I mean, number one, we talked about this with the baby, your wee little baby, right? You mentally and emotionally prepare yourself. So getting a clear understanding, getting your head around what is the board role, that it's going to be changing, it's going to be staying intense. So that means we need to address burnout. That means we are going to need to address capacity, right? If your board has been a rock star solid board for 8 years or 10 years, that this phase, knowing that it might last 18 months or more, it's unlikely that everyone on the board is going to be able to sustain themselves or that they even will have the same desires. Some people like being a working board and they don't really have the desire or stamina or skill set to be a governing board, to be able to step back more and to kind of transition into that phase, right? So that's a big understanding to say, okay, well, we need some support. We need to support our board. We need to probably bring in some fresh um, capacity, and let's have a plan. Let's mark this on our governance calendar, on our annual board calendar, and plan for this in advance so that we know it's coming, so that we can prepare ourselves mentally and emotionally.
And I can't stress enough that it's put it in the pro forma. You're going to need to invest in support to get through this. Now, not everyone out there know, I mean, this is kind of a new concept, this transitional governance. Now, some people who work in governance who've supported start boards before are going to recognize a lot of this. But a lot of this is new to really talk about it this way. And you need to find support that at least has heard about the idea of transitional governance and understands that it's going to be different and a startup and can be your partner in walking through this. But walking through it alone won't work. And something that came out of our stage 5 session last night, there were people on who had actually opened a food co-op. We're on the other side now, and who said, if I did not know, I had been told that I would hand it over to the GM, and after we open the store, I just go, this is great. And when I realized I was running around just as hard, I had so much work to do to support the GM, so much work to do to make sure that to monitor if the co-op was successful. To be honest, the thing I felt in my body was rage. And because this isn't what I thought I'd signed up for, and we want you to get mentally, emotionally prepared for the fact that the work will be different in stage 4 and stage 5, but it will not be less. Find out what it is and how your board is going to prepare to get through it and decide if you're the one to sign up for it. I can't stress this enough. Please read the Startup Transition Leadership Handbook. Something it does talk about extremely well, even though it was written back in 2021, is that it talks about how to build a team energy and a team with your GM. Read it together as a board, section by section. It's not that long. If I was in stage 3, I'd be like, dude, I've seen startups say to me, we read this section by section and then had a discussion at every board meeting. Hallelujah. And they felt like so much more like, oh my God, there's so many things. Oh, I didn't know you thought that. Where are we prepared for this? Wait a minute. I thought we were on alignment about that. And they found out just through reading this and discussing it or in underlying what the heck does this mean? Who are we going to ask? This was really important to them for being ready for this transitional governance phase. Discuss, process, and make sure what you understand what team is because it's critical to be building a team relationship with your GM. As Bonnie pointed out earlier, really well. I remember how Zay exactly said it, but I really liked it. It was like the board and the GM, I call it the strategic leadership team when you are working together on an issue, and you guys are walking into the dark together, and you have maybe a lantern that throws light a certain way because you know a lot about your community, your co-op, your pro forma, but your GM's got a flashlight that's going to highlight other things, but you both don't know how you do not know what this cavern's going to hold. This cave that you are walking into. You're at the beginning of your D&D adventure and you need to be a team.
So, right, we're in stage 3. We're getting ready to hire that general manager. And in addition to thinking about these, right, we're thinking about transitioning emotionally and getting ourselves ready. We've read the guide. Next comes building our policies, right? And there is not a startup specific guide on how to use policy governance during transitional leadership yet. Growth mindset, JQ, thank you. It's not here yet. It needs to be here, right? Maybe someone on this call is going to be the one to write it. The core policies will serve you. And so learning about how to create them and working in them as a team and learning them deeply is going to be essential for this stage of transition. And it really becomes the application of them in transition that is still being defined. So you really need to find support, as named before, finding support that honors this transitional governance is different. You need to find someone that understands that and will work with you on this to help set this up. And we're going to talk more about that. That's kind of a lead into, well, how do we determine what the hell we're supposed to be doing and like when and how we're transitioning? And that's really around kind of defining operations.
That's a big piece of it. I want to bring up from the chat. Someone asked, well, oh, so like could we delegate the board delegates part of the GM, but we don't have a GM yet. What about the project manager? And I want to just bring that up here because I thought Gold Star project managers, employees that you have before the GM are absolutely the place to start practicing these policies. And Bonnie, your board did this when you were the project manager of your
Yes.
startup. I wonder if you could just give us a minute on what that was like.
Yeah, so at the time I was like, where's the project manager job description? There was not one that existed at that point. Where is the project manager reporting guidelines, right? That is part of policy governance. There was not one, but some of the folks that were working with Monadnock Food Co-op's original board, they were like, oh, this is work on building it together and practicing it. And so some of the policies don't apply, right? Because the store is not open yet. A number of them do. And so it is really good practice. Even if the project manager will leave as soon as the GM is there, you working together on building up systems, on feeling like on practicing flexing that muscle, on receiving reports, understanding what we want in reporting. And this is where you don't have to recreate the wheel, right? You can ask other successful food co-ops, Chris, JQ, someone else to be like, what co-op has great reporting template? I'm sure there's other examples as well. And you can do the messy work. It's going to be messy, right? Because you're green in this role. So it's if you have a project manager, absolutely practice with them and understand what it's going to feel like to get, this structure of accountability where you're needing information and you're needing windows into the operations, even if the operations is not with the store yet, right? So I think going through that and practicing it is amazing if you have that opportunity.
And what different project managers do is different. Some of them might not be available to help you think through building the policies and practicing them, as in like you're working on that part together, but you could be working with your governance support to put together those policies and then talking to the PM about how you're going to practice them with them and if that's going to be part of their role. Because PM project manager can mean so many different things. So I just want to be careful. So you're like, my construction project manager is not going to help us do this part. Like, yeah, but you still can use those policies and practice what you'd be holding someone accountable to who you've delegated a lot of your responsibility and authority for the owners to.
Mm. Yeah, and that's interesting. Joel said practice with your committees too, meaning have clear expectations and reporting, right? And folks that have committees where there are not clear expectations and reporting, you're going to feel the pain of that. You're going to see turnover. There's a lot of things that are going to come up if you do not have that. So yes, there are layers where you can practice that with your committees.
And we're, to be honest, I was really honest, we are scratching the surface of this topic today. This is an overview, and there are numerous other present. I would say, look at the stage five presentation, look at the GM crisis presentation, but also there's other things, the other presentations as well, that FCI has done on this. But there's, like I said, there's still a lot of work to unfold this. But one thing that I identified in working with startup boards, that was really challenging is if you know policy governance. And so this might be a bit of a jump for some people, but if you know policy governance, it says, okay, we're going to decide how we're going to delegate. And then we have these executive limitation policies. That's what we're going to write to hold the GM accountable. And we have these ends. That's our values and our goals. And, but this part where we say a big part of policy governance is that we're going to give operations to the GM and the board will stay out of it, other than to monitor and ask for reports. What is operations? And I, for fun, asked all sorts of people who've been in the industry for a long time, GMs, board members, all sorts of folks, and none of them had the same answer. And I think this is one of those things we have come across, that we've been encouraging with startups that's really important is the board is actually the one who creates the policy that says we will delegate operations to a general manager. So therefore, the board defines what operations is. We want robust input from the GM once they show up, but we want the board to kind of get their mind around what it means first. And so this is like we have like 2 seconds to go over this, but there is a spreadsheet that we use, and the exercise that we've got that we go through. We can't facilitate this for every startup, so I can tell you there is at least one governance person who's worked with these materials, who works with startups with the materials we created on how you facilitate walking through where does defining operations fit into your policies, and then the facilitation of the process. And it's important for it to be facilitated, I'll be honest. Some startups are like, we'll just go off and do that. And you can. I'll like, great, thanks for the spreadsheet, we'll go do that. But what really emerges a more powerful conversation about what is and isn't operations is when you get to just participate and someone else helps you ask yourself these questions and understand. And I forgot to put the slide in here. I can share the spreadsheet, but it's not the instructions on how to do it. We need to define, where is this thing governance? Is this thing operations? Is this thing operations but strongly partnered? So we want the GM to ask our opinion. Is this governance, but strongly partnered? The GM should have a right to have input, but it is the board's decision. Or is it one of those rare things that are kind of in the middle that we will share responsibility for together? It's not just one or the other, there's really gradations to it. And working through that and being prepared to realize and to know that what is operations when you first bring in a GM you've never worked with before can be tighter, right? We talked about you can be delegating some of this to a finance committee, to a mentor, to your NCG rep that you're working with, where you say, you need to make these decisions with the NCG rep until this point or whatever. The operational definition can be tighter with the goal of getting it to what is pretty standard in an established food co-op. So it's kind of a subset of your policy process, but it's not only critical for understanding what operations is, but for the board to own its role. That you're the one. Someone said we still share responsibility. Actually, you kind of don't. You have responsibility. You picked this GM, you delegated what you decided was operations to them, and you are accountable for what they do, for how they perform, because they can leave that job and you're still accountable to the community. And so that's not saying the GMs have a lot of responsibility. I have been one. We absolutely do. But it's saying that this process helps you understand what exactly are we delegating and what does that mean? And it's really, I've seen boards not do it and boards do it. And I think it's critical for the understanding of what you're about to do. We don't have a lot of time for Q&A, but we got a few minutes here. And we're going to ask people to put in the chat so we can keep it to questions that are very specific to what we're doing right now. I can say a little after if there's some of the questions that we can't get to or that are less specific to this topic. So anyone, and you can raise hands too if it's specific to this topic.
I have a question for you, JQ, while people are
Yeah.
thinking. That line, like now knowing what we know about this period of transitional governance, is that line going to shift? Like how and when will that line shift? And when do we have those conversations, right?
Yeah, that's why I wish I could do a whole session on that. So I'd say that you're going to create a definition of operations where you're going to start. You hire your general manager. They get to read those over, think them through, give you feedback. You will make adjustments or not based on their feedback. And then you both will set a goal for where you want it to be eventually. And that will be done with the board and GM. So we're here and we'd eventually like it to be here. And I've actually seen it work best when the GM just takes it after we're starting here and they've gone off by themselves and said, well, I'd like it here eventually. This is where I'd like authority. This is where I'd like operations to be. And so they get to lead that process. The board led here's how we're defending operations now, you're giving input. The GM gets to say, well, I've defined how I'd like operations to be once we're established. And then the board gets to give some feedback and go, let's decide if we're comfortable with that. Let's do some research. Let's think things through. And then it's how are we going to get from here to there? And that's where I wish we had better mapping. And we don't. I will say Assabet Co-op Market did this process. And I think, and through the whole, from the beginning to the end, and while they had a very experienced general manager who was pretty much a unicorn, they ran the whole process. And so if, they're doing a session tomorrow night on their transitional governance phase as a board and GM. I encourage you to come listen to them. But it is a multi-step process that we don't have completely hammered out yet. And that's just where we are. But definitely, it will not, your definition of operations when you open will not be your definition of operations for very long. It will keep shifting, it will keep evolving until a certain point, and then it shouldn't evolve very often at all. But it is revisited. I've started co-ops that you did this process 5 years ago that said they still bring it out once a year to say, do we feel any of these things should shift on what is operational and what is the board's? And does the GM have things they want to shift? And they have that conversation once a year and they find, oh, this situation came up and nobody knew whose job it was. The GM thought it was theirs, the board thought it was theirs, and there was tension. We figured it out, but let's now map it to our definitions of operations. We now know who has authority. And so it becomes an ongoing tool, but that evolution will slow down as you get closer and closer to established status and your relationship and your strength as a board get built up. All right.
Joel, I see your hand up. You're muted.
You're muted, sir.
Yeah, it's not a question. I just want to add a thought that I love the way you framed all of this. It's so great. And in addition to defining operations, the board defines the frequency of reporting
Hmm.
and what an acceptable report looks like. You mentioned like NCG or something like that. So maybe as part of this is what an acceptable report looks like. It's like so we want to report on this thing and we want our NCG expert or some other person to weigh in on this report before you bring it to us.
Hmm.
So the board can do all that, and that's a great way of really getting the depth of what you want without putting your hands in.
Mm.
And we didn't have time to go into a whole session on proper reporting during transitional governance, but absolutely. I think that if you're experienced in policy governance and food co-ops or have trained in it, there is a very rigid way historically that food co-ops use policy governance. And that is not, by the way that all cooperative industries use it. A lot of other co-op industries use it, and they're much more creative and flexible with it. And there's absolutely, so you need someone who can work with you and understand policy governance is people sometimes say, oh, policy governance doesn't apply right now. And whenever I hear that, and I'll hear that from experienced people in the industry, I'm like, oh my God, because that's not true. How often you need to report on what I call you need a window, what the board needs a window to, how detailed you need those reports to be. That's all within policy governance's purview, and
Mhm.
it is very and can be very relational with your GM.
Mhm.
To help them be a success. So we don't have time for it. And I know Joel would have a lot to contribute to that conversation as someone who's been doing governance for startup food co-ops for a very long time.
Mhm.
But yes, there are other, I think this was the only piece I thought was missing. I think in the reporting, what's missing is just the flexibility and creativity that can really help a startup flourish in how we tend to currently talk about it.
Mm.
Leslie?
Yeah, I'm very thankful for this. I unfortunately missed most of the session, so I'm really hoping to catch at some point. But I, having heard a lot of this too before and living it currently, my contribution, I guess, and my thought is, thinking about my session tonight, I 100% agree, JQ. This thought that it doesn't apply, policy governance doesn't apply. I am guilty of saying and writing that same sentiment, but
Mm.
I'm really glad that we're having conversations about restructuring this transitional period to define what those reports look like and helping co-ops do that. What I do think has been our experience is that our board has a certain set of knowledge and limitations to that, as does our GM.
Yeah.
And so, what reporting expectations might work for one co op might be
Hmm.
really challenging for another, depending
Mhm.
on both sets of people groups involved in that. I think you referred to it as like the strategic leadership team yesterday.
Yeah.
Hmm.
That experience, that background also plays into what's a reasonable ask of a report and being able to review it and react to it. And
Mm.
I'm only pointing out further challenges that we're experiencing in this session,
As
but
we said,
it's a
this is
starting
evolving right now. We need to hear it
it's
from
a
people who
starting
are
place.
living it.
Yeah, it's a starting place. Yeah, absolutely.
No, I think that that's really great to hear. And by the way, you're the one who gets the pass for saying policy governance doesn't work here because you're new to it and it's been fed to you wrong. And I'm just one using the word wrong. No one else said it. I did. So I will take the blame for that. But obviously, there's a lot of passion here for, and I think it's super important. This was meant to be a high view for those who are this is in the future still, and the need for really digging into how we define operations, how we build a transitional relationship and how much authority we hand to the GM and how we use reporting within that needs to be built out. And I
Mhm.
just want to say, I know we're running over. One thing I do want to say before we end is I'm actually very optimistic it can be done. I have seen it at one startup food co-op, and I think all of us have seen it in portions at different startup food co-ops. It just needs to be built. But the not letting people know that this is on the horizon is what we were hoping to nip in the bud here, and we hope you'll all continue to participate in helping us. This is a cooperative movement. We figured this stuff out together, and a lot of what you heard today, your predecessors were the people who were on those front lines figuring that out.
That's
So
right.
I do want to, real quick, I know we're a little over, but thank Bonnie so much for being here with me and working through this and with me. She gives me so much focus and clarity. She's like, we're not going to fit all that in here. So I really appreciate her. And I want to just bring up again, thank you so much to all of our sponsors this year. You guys make this possible. And again, I love talking about our sponsors because these are actually our fellow cooperators and food movement workers, people who are trying to make food a just experience for all of us. This is how they participate in this series, as well as a lot of them present. So thank you guys so much. And coming up, Leslie just mentioned it. She's going to be back tonight to talk about leading through the co-op's toughest year. She is from Prairie Food Co-op, and Food Show Co-op will also be here. They've both been open for less than once and less a year, a little over a year, talking about their experience with this and many other things and why it turned out they didn't know it was coming, that after the doors opened, that was the hardest year ever for them so far as a board. I think it's going to be a tough conversation. I'm really grateful to them for being willing to have that tough conversation and extremely important. And then tomorrow, completely different topic. You guys are always asking, what should we be looking for in the store opening? What does the GM need to know? What should be happening? The Info team is going to be here. That is the Independent National Food Retailer Association is going to be here to talk about just the basic effective foundations of store opening that if you're a GM of a startup food co-op, you will find this useful. And if you're bored of a startup, just knowing what should be happening can be a really big help. So we hope you guys will join us. And I'm going to stop recording.